they're actually saying it's a maturity life cycle thing. It's like the same reason as like a 3-year-old might watch Baby Shark. But when you're 20, you probably shouldn't be watching Baby Shark anymore, right? Like there's phases in your life.
Until you then have a 3-year-old and you
Yes,
find
well,
yourself
yeah,
once again
that's
watching
true.
Baby Shark. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflow. This is the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, with my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, fantastic. As always, if you're on YouTube, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Really helps the podcast out, helps us grow, and we've been excited about our growth. And if you're on a Spotify or an audio platform, any audio platform, leave a 5-star review. That also helps promote the podcast. And as a heads up, you can check out our interview with Dr. Rebecca Parsons. She was kind enough to come onto the podcast and talk to us about building evolutionary architectures. I really enjoyed that interview, Nathan. What did you think?
Yeah, it was great. She's a wealth of knowledge. I think she coined the term fitness functions, if I remember correctly. And she was doing a lot of these genetic algorithms, right? That were really interesting, sort of abstract ivory tower software patterns that are quite applicable to distributed systems and building evolutionary architectures. And it was really cool to get abstract and concrete and kind of oscillate between the two, talking to her. And I think you'll like the episode a lot.
If you're a software engineer, you can get used to, especially amongst like your friends and family, like being the most tech savvy person and kind of knowing that domain really well. So it's fun to sit down with someone like Rebecca Parsons and just realize how thoroughly outclassed you are. You're like, oh wow, like this woman knows a lot more than I do. So she was great. So please check out that interview. We love talking to Dr. Parsons. And what we got for you this week is the finale, part 3 of the Unicorn Project. Unicorn Project, written by Gene Kim. We'll give you the quick author introduction and book introduction just up top so that we're all on the same page. Gene Kim, a multiple award-winning CTO, researcher, and author, and has been studying high-performing technology organizations since 1999. He's the founder and CTO of Tripwire for 13 years. He's written 6 books, including the Unicorn Project, the Phoenix Project, the DevOps Handbook, the Shingo Publication Award-winning Accelerate, and the Visible Ops Handbook series. Since 2014, he has been the founder and organizer of the DevOps Enterprise Summit, studying the technology transformations of large, complex organizations. And as far as the book introduction, we get the highly anticipated follow-up to the best-selling title, The Phoenix Project, takes another look at Parts Unlimited, this time from the perspective of software development. In the Unicorn Project, we follow Maxine, a senior lead developer and architect. She is exiled to the Phoenix Project to the horror of her friends and colleagues as punishment for contributing to a payroll outage. She tries to survive in what feels like a heartless and uncaring bureaucracy and to work within a system where no one can get anything done without endless committees, paperwork, and approvals. So like I said, this is part 3 of 3, wrapping up the Unicorn Project. And not only is it part 3 of our podcast, but the Unicorn Project is actually very nicely divided into 3 parts. So this is discussing the 3rd part of the Unicorn Project. We've had a couple thoughts in the books beforehand. Nathan, you mentioned that we talked about the 5 ideals. We've talked about dysfunction. We've talked about kind of the focus on individual contributors. As we wrap up part 3, what are your thoughts on, part 3 of the Unicorn Project, and maybe even the Unicorn Project as a whole? Oh, and I guess I should say at the top, this episode will probably be a little more spoiler heavy because it's kind of hard to talk about the finale without talking about what happens. So if you're in the middle of a Unicorn Project or you really care about having it spoiled, maybe come back to this one later. But you can also stick around. It's still a great book, even if you have some of the parts a little spoiled for you.
Yeah, and we'll try to. I think they're definitely are going to discuss some plot points. We'll try to stay a bit generic because it is fun. I mean, I think that's one of the things about this book. Unlike most of our stuff, is that it's very narrative driven. You have the hero's journey. We follow Maxine, and this is sort of the part 3 is the climax, right? So the worst things get absolutely worse, and the best things get absolutely better, and it's not a tragedy. So there's a happy ending. I don't think we're spoiling anything with that. Which again, I don't know if that has how things work out in the real world very often, but it makes for a great story. let's see. My general thoughts on this is that, yeah, I thought this was a really fun book. I think it introduces, each section also has sort of a theme. In part 3, really drums in this idea of, um, you know, not not that it's like tech enabled, but that tech is actually like core to the business itself, and it really gets into these Jeffrey Moore ideas in a much stronger way. And we've talked about it briefly in the other episodes, but Jeffrey Moore again is this sort of prolific Silicon Valley investor, and he really frames things really well as to like how do you prioritize things when we talk about stuff like context. Um, oh shoot, what is it? Context
Context and core.
versus yes,
Core.
context versus core. There's these like horizons that we'll talk about. I loved the way that I mean, obviously it's a little bit of exposition, like, the expert swoops in and it's like, hey, by the way, this is why you're doing things. But it's still fun. Like the way that the book frames it, again, if it wasn't a fiction novel and you're just reading through like, here's how to be awesome at a startup, or here's how to affect change within your organization, to be much drier. And then following the story. So I thought it was well executed. I think this is and there's a couple things I did want to bring up, general thoughts, and we'll talk about these later in. Maxine is like a super value bringer, and they
Oh
don't
yeah.
really talk about, like, comp is a weird one because, I mean, obviously she ends up getting some very cool outcomes career wise, but if this was a startup, they would have bought this startup for hundreds of millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
Like if she, and I think we just saw this. It was a Google AI lead like left and started his own company, and then within a few years, Google bought them back for like over $1 billion. And now he's working at Google again, doing the same stuff that he was doing. Like that's a power play. If you affect change and then all of a sudden your division's making like $100 million extra revenue or something, they just kind of glossed over how she saw upside on that, and I thought that was kind of strange. Maybe it would have been too muddy, but I was just like, wait a minute, what about Maxine?
It is a little strange too because this is not a tech company in the book, and so it's kind of like if you're a tech company, you can kind of be like, well, she's probably got RSUs, right? But
Right.
there is
Oh
a
yeah.
question of like, wait a minute, yeah, did Maxine see anything from all of this?
Yeah. So that was one question. The other one was, who the amazing new technology that they come up with, like one of their innovation lab teams, is like super creepy, and it's not mentioned how creepy it is, like from a data privacy standpoint. They kind of breeze over that, and again, it'll be, if we have time, I'd love to chat about it, because like maybe this is my internet activist flag flying, but it was just kind of like foaming at the mouth, like, oh yeah, we got this thing, without thinking like, oh, what are the implications of this? And it was just like, I don't know. It's something worth talking about, I think,
Yeah,
later.
I mean, I think we've talked a lot about that with this novel where like it's a novel about like development and like software development, right? Because
Right.
like my whole question throughout reading this novel has been like, where's Maxine's husband? And not like in a weird way, but like in a like, what about your family? What about those you care
Mm.
and share it? There's just a lot of mention of like, and then we were at work until 9 p.m. I'm like, really? Like, this seems to be happening often, and
Right.
yeah,
And that in
just
conjunction with like, did she get RSUs? You're like, what?
exactly. Yeah. And I think the answer is like, well, it's a book, and we have to watch these characters be invested. I think I called this like the first week, kind of like the inverse of Clean Coder, where I kind of saying like it's similar. I guess maybe similar to Clean Coder. You got to take some of it with a grain of salt, right? Like I would not read this book and be like, this is exactly how I should, organize my career, because I think some of these people might be taken for a ride, like you were saying, Nathan. Yeah, I really enjoyed this part. I mean, it's been my favorite part of the book. It gets a little more into like some of the businessy stuff we talked
Yeah.
about. Crossing the Chasm was brought up, which I know is a book you've brought up on the podcast a couple times before, Nathan. And so yeah, kind of cool to see that in action. There is some executive politicking, which is interesting. And it's just nice to see the characters get their due. Like we said, it's a happy ending, right? Maybe they don't get their due monetarily. We don't know that, but they do. They do kind of succeed in bringing change to Parts Unlimited. So that's a lot of fun. Well, we got a lot of stuff to talk about with the book this week. We're going to be back with all that and more in just a bit right after this break. And we are back. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. Yeah, well, let's get started with Unicorn Project. So they're gearing up for Black Friday. That's kind of where we left off last time. They're doing this promotions project, kind of trying to generate some dynamic promotions for their customers on Black Friday. Little over 2 weeks away at this point in the book, and so what are they doing? They're kind of what's going on here, Nathan? They come up with the code name, the Unicorn Project, and that
Yeah.
that encompasses sort of what? Do you
We
remember
yeah,
exactly?
we find out that the title of the book, right?
Exactly.
So, Phoenix Project ended up being important enough that they realized that, they've really embraced this sort of microservices or domain specific design patterns, and it actually spins off 3 projects. It's not just Unicorn Project, which is where our main characters are. There's also another project called Narwhal, another one called Orca. And yeah, they ended up I liked this. They kind of like started these experiments, like figuring out, hey, if we decouple these teams, here's my hypothesis. I think we can build this thing pretty quickly and turn it around and then do a demo day. Like that's like a really important pattern that they introduce here. And again, this is where the idea is still kind of a baby idea. They don't know how they're going to run this at scale. They're not sure how it'll affect other parts of the system. They're not worried about that, right? They're just focused on, can I test this hypothesis? And um, it I thought this was really a cool example of like what we've been building up to, because it really shows how the empowered teams can make decisions um interacting with each other. And it can there's this whole idea of real business problems that they're solving. They have a bunch of inventory in warehouses. They also have some data about the customers and some behavior, and they are able to build this little tool that can dynamically generate promotion material that kind of fits that sweet spot across the data of like, oh, we have a lot of this inventory. It's got high margins, and this is a person who we think would find this type of information valuable. And turns out that it like works really well. Like they kind of starts inspiring a lot of the teams in the marketing and these other groups. And I think this is a big turning point for, okay, we've been building up to this. We've had this the rebellion doing these things, and now they're starting to kind of get mainstream as far as their ability to like inspire other departments. I thought it was pretty cool. I'd love to hear your input on this
Well,
kind of
I
transition
think
point.
I have 2 thoughts. One, they call it the Unicorn Project, and they call kind of everything, all the services associated with it. They kind of give it names like I think they call it like Narwhal, and I can't remember all the other one. Narwhal, Orca. Um, but so they give it called like animal names, and I think at least narwhals I know have like a pointy thing on them. I couldn't figure out if everything had a pointy thing. Anyhow, I started my first job was at like a large entertainment company which owned like a lot of different media properties, and it was drilled into my head by our director that we don't name anything after like any of the media properties, like because like he was just very big on like we name things after what they do, right? And so uh like so when we see like code names like this, like I know that's how most people do it, but like he just hated when it was like, oh no, like boss baby is down. It's like, what are you talking about, boss baby is down? Right, like just tell me what's actually down. um so anytime I see like clever names like this, I'm like, yeah, I don't know what
I,
Daniel would think about that.
that's hilarious. So I do think that they should be decoupled from like the core business, but I'll tell you, I'm a perpetual project namer. Um, One of the projects that I did at one of my last companies was an internal initiative to get a lift and shift initiative to move from a bunch of VMs into Kubernetes, and we're in the airline industry, and so we actually called it Airlift.
Ah,
Um,
nice.
and we ended up getting like a ChatGPT generated logo and a bunch of other stuff, and it was kind of, I heard this is like very popular in the platform engineering world, which is that it's like, can you put the logo on a hat? And can you
Ah,
get people to talk about it? And I think internally it can be kind of whimsical and useful. Another project we were working on is a blue-green deploy pattern for one of our services. And one of the team members came up with the idea of Project Cyan. which,
Oh,
cyan
that's
is this
cool.
like
Yeah, yeah.
transitional color between blue and green. And so it was easy for other people to talk about us. And I think from an internal marketing standpoint, it can be useful. Now, if we had named it off of something that was like an actual product that we had, um, and they talked about this, they were like, "Oh yeah, can we do something from Kill Bill or The Matrix or these other things?" And you're like, yeah, a lot of those can have negative connotations to them, and so naming's hard, right? It's one of the two
Yeah.
hard things in computer science. But that's fascinating. I like I like the leadership hot take of like don't name stuff. That's kind of a
Yeah,
fun
yeah. My
fun
current
alternative.
company has a bit of an initiative from the CEO as well, of like name things after what they do. It's like we have something that used to be called Melody, but now we call it the commercial data platform. I don't really have a ton of strong feelings on this. I just it was my first job out of college, and like so it was just drilled into me. And I have a lot of respect for that director, and so
Right.
like I yeah, his advice is sits deep within me.
I will say though, the rest of we were kind of weirdos when we name it whimsical names, or because the rest of the company everything was like the 3-letter acronym for like the data platform. So it'd be like, oh, DP over here, and everybody you
Yeah,
get so acronym heavy that you're like, I have no idea what anyone is talking about.
yeah.
So
That's like I saw someone on Reddit talking about like those acronyms that like only exist in computer science, were like I-18N, which stands for like internationalization, because 18 is the number of letters between the I and the N in internationalization.
yeah,
Like that's a weird thing that we do. Um, so that was just my first thought. I'm like, I don't know about naming stuff. Uh, um, and then my other thought was just there's a lot of talk in here that they start moving things to the cloud, which I'm a big fan of. And we're going to talk about core versus context, which kind of resonated deeply with me. And they're they're doing a lot of stuff that's like a developer's dream. Like in particular, they've got kind of all this like disparate data within the company, and it's really hard to analysis. And they're like, okay, what if we kind of start bringing this all into like one data warehouse? We make like a data platform, which is really similar to some of the teams I work with at my current company. But And so this results in a much better developer experience. But I think one of the big takeaways from this book is the developer experience is great, but the business doesn't care about the developer experience, right? The reason this is such an important initiative and gets leadership buy-in is because of the business value it generates. Because once you have all this data under the same platform, you can then use it to generate these Black Friday promotions. And so I know I've been guilty of this. I think developers in general are guilty of this, where they're so focused on developer experience, we can't actually articulate why it would be valuable for the business. And there's truth to the idea that like just a more pleasant developer experience makes you move faster, which means you can deliver features faster. So I don't think it's like every developer experience thing you do has to have a concrete dollar justification. But it's certainly easier for big initiatives if you can prove to the business why it's going to be a good move.
yeah.
So they do launch on Black Friday. And I guess before kind of Black Friday, they're like we said, they're doing developer experience. They're doing chaos engineering, which we've talked about before. This idea of kind of active. I think this is, if not invented by Netflix, and popularized by Netflix, right? Of actively trying to break your servers. I will say that at parts of here, like at this point, they're becoming kind of like a world class organization, right? They're able to do multiple deploys a day. They're able to fix things like on the day of Black Friday. And especially like chaos engineering, they're unplugging stuff during simulations just to make sure that everything's working okay. Like there's a part of me that was like, wait a minute, how long is it this like we're like 3 months into like Maxine's Exile to the Phoenix project. Like to me, I would expect this kind of like organizational shift to take much longer than three
Right.
months. But I don't know. What was your read on it, Nathan?
Yeah, no, the timelines I'm there's in movies and TV shows there's the suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm this is where my suspension of disbelief is that I'm just accepting the timelines. Like that's I
Yeah.
was just like I'm just going to accept these. She's a superhuman, and once everyone's kind of accepted these new patterns, they're like so unblocked. Somehow, I will say magically, somehow um this initial wins on being unblocked has like just unblocked them in general. which I don't think would be in the real world. Like I think you keep discovering, oh crap, yep, we got to go talk to Bobby over here. Like
Yeah, yeah.
like these kind of things would still come up. Um, but you know, suspension of disbelief. We're gonna be like, okay, cool, they're firing all cylinders. Also, it is weird. It's like there's that thing where it's like the meme where it's like there's like the idiot and there's like the Jedi master, and then there's like this curve in the middle. And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
like the idiot does it this way, and then when you get better, you do it this other way, and then you become Jedi master and you're back to doing it the same way the idiot is. Is I feel like it's like yes, they have these amazing processes in place, but there's also like very Star Wars cowboy coding style insanity going on. Like they're shipping stuff really fast, but then they're also having to like fix stuff really fast, and they actually can now. But I'm also still looking at it and being like, all of this is because of these accelerated timelines. Like you're doing insane things.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, it's the whole idea is that, oh, we're saving the business, we're doing these other
Mhm.
things. Also they're able to, measure and react really quickly. Like I think one of the big things they show is like monitoring is amazing now. They can pinpoint problems. They were able to like preempt I think this is where like a bunch of weird 500 errors were showing up. And before it actually became a big problem, they were worried about signal versus noise, which I think is a huge problem in any organization. Is if you start getting alerts that are meaningless, you'll miss the real alerts that are meaningful. And when things go sideways, it becomes really difficult to sift through that data. And so their obsession with meaningful data showing up in their logging and metrics. I think they also show this idea that like synthetic load testing is really hard. Um,
Yeah.
so there were some surprises, right? So one of the cool things that they did is that to a subset of their customers, they launched some stuff a few days before, like I think it was like 2 or 3 days before Black Friday, to see
Yeah.
if the system would fall over, and they identified some real problems. Um, and I thought that was again good example of I've been in organizations that are proactive like this, and it's amazing because you kind of get what we call like a dress rehearsal. Which for maybe not everybody from the theater world is that a dress rehearsal is like you do a production just like you do a real show with a very limited audience, maybe just for the director, so that we all can get used to what it feels like to do the play
Uh-huh.
with the real lights and the real sound and everything. And it kind of it gives you the opportunity to iron out the kinks or wait for pausing for laughter or these other things. And the team learns a ton. And I think that was the big thing is that Maxine and the others are like, oh, I'm so glad we got to do this in like only a small set of customers. Because surprising things fold over, right? The mobile app can't handle certain things, or some backend they realize when the traffic goes up that some other thing folds sideways, and they have to get ready for it. And it's like in the near term, it's actually way worse, right? Like all of a sudden, nobody can go to their shopping cart, or nobody can get any suggestions. I think they're also really worried about like what they keep bringing up, like somebody in Arizona gets recommended snow tires
Snow
or
tires.
something,
Yeah, they
right?
keep mentioning that as kind of like
Yeah,
the worst case scenario, or like a sign that the promotions will be really ineffective.
right.
Speaking of theater, did you do theater in high school too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my mom actually, so that's how I met my wife. My mom's like a theater director, and
Oh,
she
cool.
taught improvisational like acting classes
Oh,
for like the
nice, nice.
community. I was in a small town, and yeah. So I grew up doing a bunch of like community theater and stuff.
So, because I did theater in high school too. I was in Beauty and the Beast. I was the menu, and
Ooh,
so yes, I was also when I was a villager. My character read it said I was Fishman. And my friends and I, we were unsure if I was like a man who sold fish or some sort of like hideous half man, half fish monstrosity. We
you could have.
assumed the latter.
Oh,
I was
good.
disappointed my costume did not also make
Dang,
that assumption.
you could have been
Um,
both. That would have been great.
ooh, yeah, oh
Yeah.
yeah, maybe. Oh, I'm
So
like
yeah,
I'm a
even
sellout. I'm
more
selling like
complex because you're like, why are you selling your brothers and sisters? You
I'll
half
talk to my friends
fishman.
about this. We'll get the lore updated.
Yeah.
Um, we no, but I was just thinking about we would do something called Tech Week, which was like kind of like almost not like a week long dress rehearsal. You wouldn't do the whole play, but it was like I remember it was like the theater equivalent of almost like band camp, but different because band camp happens at the beginning of the season, and then Tech Week would happen like right at the end, and that would be like a whole week where that's when all the tech people would come and you just kind of practice lots of different things like the special effects and the lighting and things like that. I haven't thought about Tech Week in years. And
Well,
I was just
so
thinking about
I've
that now.
actually I brought this up because my undergraduate is in theater, focused in sound design. So I was in the technical theater end of things, and I'll tell you that theater productions have a lot of overlap with startups. You are on time constraints, you're on budgets, you're doing cross-functional teams. You have to think about trade-offs. You have to work with the talent that you have. You have to have a lot high trust environment if the production is going to be good. And if you look at that, that overlays tremendously with a lot of the stuff that we're talking about here. I feel like a few years ago, maybe like 10 years ago, it was like the new hotness, and all the like Forbes and stuff was saying like the MFA is the new MBA. Like people who
Oh,
have like a fine
interesting.
arts background actually have like a leg up in business. And it's really weird to think about, but like, yeah, when I was reading, you know, Aeschylus to Ibsen, or a bunch of like Shakespearean plays, and doing like primary source research and all these other things, like a lot of that ties in, even though it's very different subject matter. Like a lot of it tied in. And I will say, to tie into this book, there's a lot of cross-functional expectations of Maxine, right? One of the reasons
Yeah,
that she
yeah.
does so well, and I think that this really ties in to the next chapter that we're about to get to, is we start really digging into the phases of a project. The framework that Jeffrey Moore, again, we've talked about him. He's got two books that are brought up. One's called Zone to Win. The other one's called Crossing the Chasm, and they both have really interesting core concepts on, like, well, when is it appropriate to have flying fast and loose, promotions project like the Unicorn Project, and when is it okay to have a bunch of bureaucracy? And it's
Yeah.
not saying that there should never be bureaucracy. Actually, they're actually saying it's a maturity life cycle thing. It's like the same reason as like a 3-year-old might watch Baby Shark. But when you're 20, you probably shouldn't be watching Baby Shark anymore, right? Like there's phases in your life.
Until you then have a 3-year-old and you
Yes,
find
well,
yourself
yeah,
once again
that's true.
watching Baby Shark.
Right.
That's us and Bluey at this house, which is a fantastic show, but
Yeah.
it's on pretty much all the time. Um, yeah, so the Black Friday promotions, they go really well, make lots of money for the company, and so now it's kind of a question of like, okay, well, what does this mean for the future of the company? And there are some disagreements. There's an executive who, this doesn't line up with her vision for the company. She's been kind of on the side of like the board and their private equity partner, who kind of just wants to sell the company for pieces. She's really not bought in on kind of the growth idea for Parts Unlimited. So that's when the the character whose job is to give exposition starts talking about kind of these different horizons, right? So he talks about the 3 different horizons for a company. Horizon number 1 is the company's cash cow, right? So this is what's generating all the cash for the company, right? This is what's keeping them stable. And if I'm remembering correctly, Nathan, this is kind of where you want the bureaucracy and red tape, right?
Yeah, this is Google AdWords, right? Like,
Yes.
almost all the revenue for Google is coming from their ad spaces that are happening, and I would imagine that's a very bureaucratic and mature part of their business, right?
Yeah,
That's
it's
they're just printing money, right?
exactly. Because then what you have next is you've got your Horizon 2. This is your high growth stuff. This is your potential next cash cows, right? So you can imagine for other businesses, kind of taking Google for example, right? Like I imagine that Android, when it started out, right, was not probably quickly grew into being their Horizon 2, right? I imagine that Android these days is a cash cow for Google through the App Store, and I'm sure all the subscription services they sell on top of that. But Horizon 3 is where it gets interesting, right? That's the pool of ideas to explore. This is yeah, I mean, really your big bets, right? And the book mentions that like out of all the kind of Horizon 3 ideas you might explore, I think they said like having a success rate of like if you're talking about like big strategies, I think the book says it's like you should only expect like 1 out of every 3 big strategies to really have any impact. And when it talks about like details you implement in service of the strategies, you'd expect like 1 out of every 20 to work. So the point with Horizon 3 stuff is like you have to be trying a lot of it. And to try a lot of it, you can't get everything wrapped up in red tape. And I thought this was interesting. It's like having like this it's like multiple personality disorder, right, as a company, because and it makes sense in like your Horizon 1 stuff. Like you're talking about AdWords, right? I imagine like the news feed at Facebook, right? That's probably like prime Horizon 1 cash cow business. It's got to be really stable. But then at the same time, you have to be trying all of these new sort of Horizon 3 business ideas. And to be trying lots of Horizon 3 business ideas, you need to, it needs to be like a pretty lightweight framework. You can't have a lot of bureaucracy and red tape because you should be expecting lots and lots and lots of your Horizon 3 stuff to just flat out not work, which I thought was interesting.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a really cool framework to think about um, allowing these, high failure but high reward, high risk, high reward sort of pieces to be in place, and for the organization to introspect without having to like constantly be dictated, right? I think you should be able to identify, is the project I'm working on Horizon 3, Horizon 2, or Horizon 1? Um, in the framework of the zones, I thought this was interesting. So he has this like quadrant, and I'll do my best to describe it. We'll try to also have links to some of this material in the show notes. But in the bottom left corner is this idea of the incubation zone. That is Horizon 3. And he kind of defines this as disruptive innovation and enabling investments, right? So, yeah, it may not work out. They haven't proven that this is going to be a high revenue performance yet, but this is the place that you experiment because you're looking for things that can eventually transition into Horizon 1, right? And Horizon 1 can actually be, again, Horizon 2 is what they call the transformation zone. This is, we've proven that it has revenue performance and it's a disruptive innovation, right? We don't know if it's a sustaining innovation, meaning we don't know if there's a long-term market for it. It could just be that it's on a trend, right? It could just be that, and you could probably imagine this with a bunch of large language model intermediary startups, right? A subset of those might actually be so useful that they end up having a sustaining innovation with either the relationship with OpenAI or some internal core innovation that they have. But and maybe they're generating cash, like maybe they're showing there is a market for it. But then there's the third one, which is the Horizon 1. And he actually says that they can be in two classes. So the whole right hand side of the quadrants are Horizon 1. And one of them is a performance zone. So that is sustaining innovation that has revenue performance. I think that's the one that if you want to just print cash, that's what we're talking about. And then there's what's called productivity zone, which is a sustaining innovation that has enabling investments. This is the one I know less about, but I have a feeling that it's basically it is a sea change in how problems are solved within the organization. But this is another one where it's a mature product. There's a lot of things around it. And again, if you notice though, every bit of this is customer centric, right? And it's a way for someone like Maxine, who's this world-class engineer, to think about how they build stuff. Where do they, like, how many risks can they take? Where is failure acceptable, right? Horizon 3 failure's got a very high level of acceptability. We should expect it. The leadership should expect it. The leadership should come in and say, okay, it's okay. Like, we're gonna do all these experiments and it might break off. Where Horizon 1, compliance, consistency, these ideas of bureaucracy, rules, you're putting up a lot of guardrails to make sure that don't don't kill the goose with the golden egg, right? We want the goose laying the golden eggs. Keep the goose happy. But yeah,
Yeah,
I thought it was cool.
it can be helpful to understand, like we've talked about, like understanding, okay, are you core or are you context? Where does your team fall? Similarly, it can be helpful to understand which horizon am I on as a team. Because I think some people, like Google is a good example, right? Where like Google, whatever its reputation is today, right? It has had a reputation for being very innovative, for being kind of on the front lines. They have kind of their whole Google Labs, right? Which is where they're just kind of working on crazy projects. They're big bets in the future. And if you have that expectation of Google, you can join and then be frustrated when all your uptime is kind of like just on AdWords, or your time is just spent making sure like AdWords is performant, right? And you can think, I thought I was joining this really transformative company. And it's like, well, parts of it are. or are, and you have to have the sustaining parts of the company as well, your Horizon 1 stuff, your cash cows. And with that probably comes more red tape. I mean, at the last place I was at, which was a cloud provider, like that's what I worked on, right? It was a big, like most of our time went into just keeping the product up and running. We did a little, some improvements around the edges there. But part of the reason we kept the product up and running is because it generated like $1 billion in revenue for the business every year. And I think like 40% of that was profit, 'cause it was cloud. And so, the margins are just crazy high on it. But you can get a little bit of like, tonal whiplash or whatever because the company's obviously going to hype up like the cool new stuff. And aren't we so innovative, transformative? And you're like, well, I'm just keeping this big system up and running. So I think I'm understanding where you fall there can help you out. Well, Nathan, any more thoughts about the horizons before we take a quick break and move into some of the other hot topics for the book?
No, I think this is a perfect time to take a break. Let's do it.
Well, let's do it. Okay, we'll take a quick break. We're going to be back with more, kind of round out the Unicorn Project. There's going to be talk about some things that have been hot in the industry lately. So stick around. And we are back. So at this point in the book, there's, like we talked about, there's an executive who really isn't bought into the growth path of the business. She actually, and this were a little spoilery, she gets bored buy-in, and they too believe that it's not that's not the right path for the business. And instead, what they want is 4% cost reductions, which for Parts Unlimited, the company, is about $15 million, and the CEO wants to make it $20 million because he's really wanting to fund. He has this idea for like this innovation group, kind of like Google Labs, like we were just talking about, where for $5 million a year, they're going to have developers who, like, their whole job is to kind of explore these Horizon 3 ideas. But it just makes these layoffs a little more costly because, again, they can't just do 15 million costs. They need to do 20 million. And then the information technology department is, I think, specifically tasked with coming up with about $5 million worth of costs. So it means layoffs, right? Which is a very popular topic in the industry right now. I know that many of us have been victims of layoffs. It's very, it's never fun. Nathan, what's your experience with layoffs and kind of going through all that? Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, it's I look at this and I think this is you know, this is like a Dave Ramsey thing. I'm like a big fan of Dave Ramsey, and he actually argues that layoffs are a failure in leadership.
Interesting.
And I think that that's actually not talked about. I mean, a lot of people defend it in the tech industry because we're kind of a boom and bust industry. Like we're very well
Yeah.
compensated. We have a lot of autonomy typically, and we also have the ability to like really impact change, right? We talk about this with Maxine. Like she works on some initiatives that turn into tens of millions of dollars in revenue immediately. Um, Most people's careers, like if you're working in accounting or you're a tow truck driver or something, like you don't have that option. And so, as part of this, the volatility of boom and bust layoffs could just be accepted. Um, I don't think though that you have to run a business this way, and it's a really like acceptable way for leadership to like fix their profit and loss, bookkeeping, because yes, the head count is expensive. Like you lay them off and you maybe have a severance for 2 or 3 months or something, depending on what your laws are in your part of the country. Um, but yeah, I'm always a bit disappointed when this is what comes up, but it's also par for the course. Like I'm never surprised. I had to experience 2 sets of layoffs at my company, like the last company I was in, while we were growing. Like we announced a set of layoffs and then announced our like latest fundraising Series D, and I think we actually had to do the layoffs to close the round, right? It's like one of
Interesting.
those smoky backroom deals that happen. And again, I'm speculating. I'm not violating a non-disclosure agreement. I don't actually know any of the details. I'm just guessing. And so yeah, it was interesting. But yeah, I would love to hear your take on layoffs and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've said before on the podcast, but I consider myself a proud capitalist, right? And but that cuts both ways, right? And not like companies lay off, and I get why they do it. And I also agree that it's a failure of leadership. I also think that's why it's important for you as an employee to recognize that, like, this company does not love you. They do not care about you. You are
Right.
exchanging your labor for money, right? Which is why I am not a huge proponent of company loyalty. Um, I think you should go to whatever company is willing to pay you the most with the best working conditions for your labor. I mean, it's a free market, right? And so you got to take advantage of that on your end too. And we are fortunate that we as tech workers often, I mean, not in this market, right? But in most markets, we often have a lot of power on our side in negotiating and bargaining because we're sought after, and we're highly skilled employees. Um, but I also say, like, I agree it's a failure of leadership, and more so than the amount you lay off, I think how you lay off sends a big signal about how you care about employees, right? Just to give kind of, I'll give two examples from the company I currently work at and then the company I previously worked at, right? The company I currently work at, I was not here for the layoffs, right? I joined after the layoffs, and they cut 25% of the company, which is like an insane amount to lay off. That's huge. But I will say they cut once and they cut deep. They and they were incredibly kind about it. They made sure to offer all the assistance to the employees they could get. Um, and then once they did those layoffs, they haven't laid off since. And I think this was the best part about doing layoffs. It came as a surprise. Just one day, the email goes out. It says, "We are laying off 25%. If you got this email, you are one of the 25%," right? Like, it's a mercy kill, which, again, no one likes to be killed or laid off, right? But if you're going to do it, that's the way to do it. Contrast that with the previous company, which handled it in, I think, the worst way I've ever seen, where they announced like 6 months in advance, like, "Oh, yeah, there will be some layoffs. Don't mention how much they're going to cut. Don't mention where it's coming from," right? Then they cut, you know, so then there's one part of the business that gets really busy around the holidays. So don't worry. They do all the layoffs on like January 1st. So they let everyone work themselves through the bone through the holidays just to lay some of them off, right? But then it's not even finished in that section of the business. And our section of the business doesn't even know when ours are coming. And so then it's another 4 months until we get our layoffs, right? Um, and then after that, and all throughout this, there's like rolling layoffs in every section of the business. Like, it's never ending. And so even though this company only wound up, I think, cutting like 4% of its workforce, like, it was a million times worse because it just, yeah, like,
Right.
and to me that really solidified my relationship with that company, and realizing like they don't care about us in the slightest, right?
Right.
Like, not even trying to pretend to care about us. Like, we are numbers on a spreadsheet, and it really motivated me to leave. Yeah, and so I just think like layoffs suck, and it sucks when you get laid off. And I think if you're in the position where you're laying people off, like, just follow the standard wisdom. Cut once, cut deep, make it a surprise, offer support afterwards. Like, in some ways, layoffs are like a solved science, and we know how to do them in a way that we know the better way to do it than not better way to do it. So if you're in that position, like, do it the better way, because, man, like, I think a lot about, I like the movie The Big Short. And if you're not familiar with it, these are the people who kind of bet against the housing market in 2008. And so they, they're there's two characters who they run a very small fund, and they kind of get the help of like a more experienced trader. And so they kind of like pull a con almost on like the bigger funds, where they wind up getting all these contracts they're going to pay out if the housing market crashes, and they're like super sure the housing market's about to crash. And so they get these contracts, and they're like cheering and whooping and hollering, and they're like, "Woohoo, we're gonna be millionaires when this is all over." And the more experienced kind of jaded trader like shuts them down. He's like, "Are you aware that every time unemployment jumps up or increases by 1%, like, suicides increase by 10,000 or something in this country?" And just kind of saying, like, you bet against the housing market, you bet against the US economy. He's like, if you might personally become rich if this all goes sideways, but like, there's a real cost. And I just feel that way about layoffs. Like, yeah, we're talking about people's livelihoods here. And it's frustrating to see companies not take that seriously.
Yeah, it's also I think we've talked about this too. Like, is it a one way decision or two-way decision?
Yeah. Yeah.
These are one-way decisions in that you know leadership a lot of times also can be pretty disconnected from what
Hmm.
actually happens in the organization day to day. And I've definitely seen this idea where they've done layoffs, but they've kept all the same timelines that they had before the layoff,
Yeah.
and and then they don't think about like the effects on morale that this can happen. You know, and this is where I think it's interesting. The way that the book dealt with this was kind of a dream scenario where these groups had autonomy over actually deciding where the cuts were happening. Like they got kind of a
Yeah.
carte
Yeah.
blanche, like come up with this much savings. Um, and they kind of step up in this idea. Well, first of all, they really try to clearly define core versus context. And I actually think my mental model of what core versus context was a bit off before this framing. Um, and this idea is that in a proper technology focused company, core can actually be pretty broad, right?
Hmm.
Like if you're writing a supporting service for the promotions team, like for the promotions product, that's not necessarily context.
Yes. Yes.
And the way they define it is like, oh, the cafeteria software or like
Or
HR
help desk
software,
ticketing
help
system.
desk ticketing system. And that is I think you and I actually are in a lot of alignment here. Where, there's this whole like continuum of build versus buy
Hmm.
of like, oh, there's open source feature flag tool. Well, is that core versus context? Well, I would say most organizations feature flags is context.
Hmm.
It is not core because there are, a dozen phenomenal feature flag as a service software companies out there. And as long as you can meet this, they can meet the scale of requests per second or the costs, it is a bunch of hidden tech debt that gets taken off your plate if you just use the service, right? Like if you switch over to LaunchDarkly or you're using, um, PostHog or any of these other tools that are just like out there, um, you will free up an entire team that, you don't have to have a feature flag team who's like
Yeah. Yeah.
doing the feature flag backend. Maybe you're big enough you need that. Maybe you're so complex in what you're doing that it really is like important. And I would imagine organizations like Google have a very fine-tuned internal feature flag system. But they also have, they're so huge that they have teams that, just do tooling all day.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. I also liked, and I'd love to get your feedback on this too. Um, I do think it was cool, and I think this is the kind of attitude you'd want to hire for, which is no sacred cows, in that um, everything was on the table, including Maxine's project, the what is it,
The
the
MRP system.
MRP system, right? And
Her old team before she got exiled to Phoenix.
right, and so she's like, hey, we have to put these guys on the chopping block too. But maybe we can give them opportunity to reallocate, like move to a different department, and they can innovate and not just be domain experts. Even though, um, even in that internal system, there's some pieces of it they identified this, right, that needed to stay in the company. It was like special secret sauce of how they operate. But a majority of it, including the payroll failure, right, that came out of this, that launched this whole book, it is really a context initiative. It really does not make sense for them to be running internal custom payroll software.
Yeah. This is kind of like the fairy tale version of layoffs, right? Because they say, well, we have
Right.
to lay off 5 million of costs, but we're actually spinning up this new group, which will cost $5 million. And so I think that
Right.
like ultimately most everyone just got reassigned into the new group. But like it's great if you can swing it.
Right.
Um, at this company I worked at, the one who handled layoffs very poorly, one of the frustrating things about it too was a lot of the teams that got laid off were teams that had taken on kind of like the big bets, the technology that the company was unsure if it was going to pay off. And traditionally, this company had a good culture of like, hey, if you take a big swing and you move over to this team that's trying something experimental and it doesn't work out, that's okay because they'll just shut the project down, but they'll rehome you to something that is working, right? But that didn't happen this time. It was just these people who had went and tried to build something which didn't work for the business. The technology behind it was stellar, um, and they just got laid off. And so that had a real chilling effect on the company because people are like, I'm not going to go work on anything unproven now. Just put me on the Horizon One stuff. Um, so yeah, like it. I like what you're talking about, like kind of sacred cows or not having any sacred cows. It's also harder to not have sacred cows when like like, again, you can imagine a situation where Maxine is like, where there isn't $5 million in the innovation fund or to rehome these people. And if instead Maxine was like, now that I think about it, my old, the MRP system, we really don't need it. And that could be the totally right business justification. You could totally onboard that to like something industry standard. But man, to say like, therefore, let's lay off all my old coworkers, right? Like, it's harder to have sacred cows. It's harder not to have sacred cows when like you are killing cows, right?
Right. I have a theory that it wasn't expressed in this book, but I was just trying to think about. So one of the characters we haven't really been saying by name, but is really important to this is Sarah, who's like the head of was it product marketing or
Retail
VP
operations, I think.
okay,
Something like that.
and she's the one who pushed through Phoenix launching. Right, she's the
Yes.
one who came in the beginning of the book and said, "Hey, we got to ship this thing," and then so far at like 14, 15, 16, she's been absent. Like she didn't come to demo day. She's not been supportive. Anytime there's like a little bit of a bug or a snafu going on, she's like, this is unacceptable. We need to go back to the old way of doing things. And I've been thinking about motivations, and I have a feeling she tried to push, I think I think she wanted to disassemble this company from day one. I don't think this is like a discovery where she's like, oh, it's come to our attention. I think she wanted Phoenix Project to fail. And this was sort of her architected thing in that despite this ragtag group, it's like a Scooby-Doo episode, right? It's like this ragtag group like of pesky kids comes in and figures out what's going on. And so I have a feeling that Sarah she'd been there 4 years. She probably was going to get she's probably looking at it like, oh, I want my stock options or, whatever that I have. Cause she's executive team. So she probably does have those. I want it to be worth something. I'd like to go get my villa in, Italy or something. And let's just sell this for parts. And at least I can get some cash value on these. And that's probably the conversation she was having with the like interim CEO who came in and kind of like, or executive or whatever, came in and like, ran things. When I framed it that way, everything Sarah was doing made a lot of sense. Because at first I was like, why is she acting like this?
Yeah.
like it was just like, oh, she doesn't know how new tech stuff works, and she doesn't have like a stomach for taking all these risks. But I was like, I think it's deeper than that. I think she doesn't have confidence that these people can pull it off, and that her investment is going to be worth something in the future. So she's taking the sure bet, which is sell the company for parts, and I'm going to get out of here. Right? That's her motivation. And I think if you frame it that way, all of a sudden, like she's not as much of she's a bad guy in the book, but she's not as much of a bad guy. I'm like, yeah, I think in a lot of companies that's probably the most pragmatic thing to do.
I agree that there have been places that are just kind of in some ways doomed. Like think about Sears, for example. Like should Sears have instead innovated and become the Amazon that we know today? Absolutely. I also think that there's a certain point where as an executive of Sears, you might have been better off realizing like, wait a minute, we're not going to make it out of this, are we? Right. Let's just sell while we can.
Right. What's the odds of Sears having a Maxine there? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Can they even attract the talent that is Maxine? Right. I think that's a really, really valid question.
Yeah, because even if you sell for part, like, yeah, sure. I'm sure a lot of the motivations are just purely selfish of like, hey, I want my money, right? But there also is this idea of like, hey, if we sell for parts now when we're worth something, then more of our employees will stay on. They'll have to go to new companies, right? But we'll have more employees aside from us just kind of slowly bleeding employees until we lay everyone off. You can tell yourself whatever story you need to kind of justify your decisions. But yeah, I mean, it's this definitely gets more into kind of like the executive politicking. There actually is a little bit of that where Sarah then kind of organizes like a counter rebellion to she whips up all the project managers and the people managers because Maxine has been she's now kind of taking these engineers to fund the innovation group or to work on the innovation group, and she basically Sarah organizes like this frenzy is too strong a word, but there is a general displeasure that all these people have been taken off their projects to work on big bets or something like that. Because at the end of the day, there is concrete features and stuff that needs to be built right now. But doesn't wind up working. Sarah does get ousted from the company. And maybe now's a good time to talk about what this what this innovation lab ultimately produces, which you had some thoughts on, Nathan.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. This innovation lab is really kind of cool. So despite we have this huge shakeup, two different visions of the company, right, that are coming out. And despite the sort of like Rome burning around them where they're having to do layoffs and think about all this other stuff, they still push through this innovation lab initiative, which is they asked all these engineers across the company to pitch ideas and that they're going to pick the sort of top ideas. They had to, I think, over 100 submissions. They had to pick 30
Something
of the
like
best
that.
ones.
They all present like in the company auditorium.
And one of the teams kind of did, again, this is like cool, scrappy stuff. And I think this is actually plausible on like what could actually come out of an innovation lab. There's this, what's the thing that you hook into the car? Is it any car enthusiast is gonna like laugh at me? It's like OED. I don't know. It's that little like there's this little like interface, and anybody who does like modifications and stuff ends up interacting with it. But it gives
reader.
It gives you a bunch of like telemetry on your car.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of you can use it to diagnose problems, but you can also do it to like tune things and other stuff. And they were saying that
you ever get the check engine light on your car, I think I searched like code reader.
Yep.
On a car code reader, and you can plug it into your car, and like that's what the mechanics use, and it'll tell you what's wrong with your car, right? Yep. Again, if you know more than nothing about cars, you probably know that, but I didn't know that for a long time, and I was surprised.
OBD.
Okay, the OBD.
Yeah. So it's this OBD interface, and it's been around forever, and it was originally to like monitor emissions and a bunch of other stuff too. But it's still around even on like Teslas. Like Teslas still have them. So what was interesting about this is that they're like, oh, there's this new interesting startup that had some cool device. They were able to like hack the firmware and put embedded Linux on there and do a bunch of other like cool things. And they showed how they have this like telemetry platform. They could like ship the data back off to, they like overrode the server endpoints, which probably violates some terms of service, but they kind of just show how they can do some cool stuff and how this would feed back into these data platforms that they have. From a purely tech standpoint, I understand the Wonderlust. From a creepy Orwellian Big Brother standpoint, I think is another example of like people don't they like the outcomes that they're getting from this device, but they're not thinking about what this actually means for like their privacy. And there's no introspection in this book about, well, how do we actually like responsibly think about, do we want to get in this type of business? And how do we handle this data in a way that honors that privacy? Can people opt out? One of the things that Maxine was looking at, she was like, oh, I'm nervous about my teenage kids driving too fast, and this would like let me know if they're driving too fast. And I recoiled. This is an interesting thing. Like, I don't want my daughter to feel that she's being ubiquitously surveilled by her parents.
Yeah.
It's really important to me to give autonomy for her to grow up and be an adjusted adult. And I've seen this because like I have nephews and nieces, and it's very common. This is called Life 365 or something like this.
Yeah.
And it's very common. And again, everyone understands their situation and they make decisions for their families. But I don't like what it's teaching our children from a panopticon standpoint of, I shouldn't speed because my dad's watching me, right?
Yeah.
I would rather them go, I shouldn't speed because I shouldn't speed, right? And if they do, and if they act a little bit like an idiot as a teenager, they need to be able to do that on their own and see what the repercussions are, which is they might get a speeding ticket or they might get in a car accident. And obviously I don't want my kid to get in a car accident, but they have to make decisions for themselves. And if I keep pushing off the date upon which they're accountable for their own actions, and again, way outside the scope of Unicorn Project, but this is the kind of
the users have told us they like our tangents, so we're
Well, I mean, so this is the thing though, is like this is an unintended side effect of being innovative inside of a company, is that like you can accidentally change the behavior of your customers in an unhealthy way is, I guess, my point. And there's no introspection here. And I think this is a Silicon Valley problem in general. There's no introspection on, we have such leverage impacting societal change. Is it my responsibility as an engineer to think about this? And I think
it's the Jurassic Park,
yes,
they were so preoccupied if they could, that they didn't think that if they should.
Right. So
right.
I'm Jeff Goldblum over here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the worst people to be. No, I feel you with the daughter and the monitoring technology too. That's something we have thought about with our sons, is kind of like, well, how do we help them to grow up and to feel like they have a good degree of agency, and they feel like they feel confident making decisions on their own. And so like one thing we do is like we let him he has a friend that he lives in an apartment complex. It's probably like a 1/10 of a mile away, 2/10 of a mile. Like it's far enough away that he needs to ride his scooter to get there, right? And our son, he's only 7, right? And we actually, when he was 6, we let him start taking himself to this apartment complex, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, because I agree with you that I'm like, I don't want my kids. Look, I mean, like when I was a kid, right? When I was a teenager, before all this stuff was around, like I married the woman I met in 4th grade, right? Lydia and I have known each other since 4th grade, right? There are some activities that led to this marriage that would not have been able to take place had we been constantly monitored and surveilled by my parents. That's all I'll say, right? And so I think it's important, and you're right that it's like we are in these tech companies that most of us are a part of, right? It's like we are in some ways transforming the way society operates in a pretty fundamental way. And we can just kind of get caught up in like, oh, wouldn't it be so cool to have all this data? And wouldn't that be so helpful for this, and this reason? And a lot of stuff we build is very helpful, right? Like Find My is kind of like location tracking. My wife and I share Find My with each other. And most of the time it's fantastic, because it's just like, if I need to figure out like, oh, is she on the way back from the grocery store? She's still there, because I can plan around it. Like super helpful, right? But there's obviously scenarios where having Find My on all the time isn't great. So I don't know. It's yeah. I think that's an interesting point you brought up, Nathan, which is like, what is our responsibility as individual engineers to evaluate what we're building?
Yep. So,
ironically, at the entertainment company I worked at, I felt that way I had a very, very strong attachment to the division I worked for. I'd grown up with those products, and then some of the stuff we would build for the products, like in my opinion, this company, their customer experience has dramatically plummeted in the past 10 years. And a lot of that comes from like the stuff engineers were tasked to build. And I was never assigned any of those projects, but I had the thought, I'm like, what would I do if I was assigned to one of these projects? Because I just fundamentally disagree with what this company is building. Yeah, I don't know.
It's a great example too. Like another little side quest here is that I feel that I know that it's the whipping boy for a lot of things, but like Netflix recommendation engine has gotten notably worse.
Yeah.
And I think it's inversely proportional to like the investment that they've made in data science and machine learning experts. Is like the more naive recommendation engine was actually more in alignment with what I was like, I used to want to see what Netflix was recommending to me. And now I find it like, I'm like, you don't understand me at all, Netflix. You don't understand me at all. And I'm just like, I don't know. It's like they're trying to be so hyper focused that they don't understand the context of like, if I watch something because I think it's like cringe hilarious is very different than watching something because I really like it. And so sometimes it'll latch on to like cringe hilarious, but they don't understand the nuance of cringe hilarious. And there's like some that's just cringe, not hilarious. And then there's like cringe hilarious, which is like a sense of humor, a very strange sense of humor that I have. And then there's like real things that I want to watch, and like Netflix can't differentiate those. And I think they like hyper hone in on like some weird thing that I'm like, okay, this is an unusable recommendations list.
My Spotify algorithm is so screwed up, because like most of what I listen to all day, like that's 90% of the usage of Spotify is like instrumental, like coding music, right? But then when I'm like actually looking for new music, I don't want that recommended to me. That's not what I listen to like in my downtime, right? And like it has no idea what I actually want to listen to. But I also think like a prime example I think of, like, engineers building something that is just making the world worse is like Amazon ads. Like, Amazon, I'm calling you out here. Like, the ads you put on your platform now suck. They suck so much. Like, Amazon used to be fantastic. Like, almost always the first or second product that would pop up in the listing is the thing I was looking for. Now I've got to scroll through all this like Alibaba junk to find what I'm actually looking for. And it's
Yeah.
like, I know it's become a
Cor-
huge cash cow for the business. But like, I can
Cory
imagine being one of the
Doctorow,
engineers. It's like, it'd be cool to be working on something that is growing for the business and is a real bright spot, for the company. But man, to be devoting your career to making Amazon just like a worse website, like, oh,
right?
that's rough.
Yeah, I think there's a really good talk I watched recently. I can't remember if it was Chaos Communications Club or if it was DEF CON that he was speaking at. Cory Doctorow is this like internet activist and science fiction writer. He writes a lot of like cyberpunk type stuff. But he was talking about how that phenomenon on Amazon is like abysmal, and they did a bunch of studies now that like the thing you actually want is like the 13th thing down
Yeah,
on
it's
average,
awful.
and then the things that are recommended above it are literally these like high margin just in time manufacturing, Shenzhen dropship businesses that is just like the garbage version of what you actually want. Like, oh, I want, some fast charging device. And I'm like, oh, I actually want this like nice one that's actually got the real regulatory compliance and stuff. And they're just like, no, the first two are the ones that are like, they're getting, 120% margins and may or may not blow up in your wall. So, yeah.
In general, I am a proponent of the idea, like kind of like the ever increasing like GDP and like this idea that people are like, oh, it's unsustainable. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I think there's a lot of untapped potential humanity has not yet explored. And that's exciting, right?
Yeah.
There are some things looking at Amazon where I'm like, ugh, like this is just becoming worse because it makes more money for it. But maybe Amazon is just making itself ripe for disruption, right? I think Google is one of those businesses. Google search is one of those things that we thought would exist until the end of time, but now we have interesting stuff. I mean, ChatGPT is not a replacement for Google search, but in some ways is. Perplexity is one of those products that is more trying to bill itself as a replacement for Google search. DuckDuckGo is another option. Like this idea that like companies like Amazon and Apple and Google are too big to fail, like isn't necessarily true, right? IBM was once too big to fail. Sears was once too big to fail. And so there is some truth to the idea that when they kind of corrupt this user experience, like they are opening themselves up to the possibility of disruption, right? Who knows when or if that'll ever happen. But you can only push a person too far before he says, I'm done looking at all these ads. Well, why don't we take a quick break and then we'll be back with the our wrap up of the Unicorn Project and our closing thoughts on this part and the book as a whole. And we are back. So at the end of the day, with the Unicorn Project, leadership does prevail. These, like we talked about, this innovation lab really kicks off and they start making a lot of good money. That they say they even talk about this kind of engine sensor business they're building, of like the idea of moving it from Horizon 3 to Horizon 2. Like this is going to become a cash cow for the business. And then it's cool just to see like the transformation that happens at the company. They're a data center. They start moving a lot of stuff to the cloud instead of being on-prem, which I'm a big proponent of. They actually have a ceremony where they destroy all these old kumquat servers, right? And I thought it was really neat. I don't have the quote on hand exactly, but they say Maxine comments that she was surprised at how excited people were to destroy something that they had built, which I just think is a really healthy attitude as an engineer, right? Like you can't be so attached to whatever you built that you want to make sure it stays alive forever. I think I saw a Reddit comment, it stuck with me for years, where someone pointed out, like, at the end of the day, like, we're all building sand castles in the surf, right? Like that's what this job is like, I remember at my internship, hearing the senior engineers like talk about like, what do you think is the oldest code you have running in production? People had to like really scratch their heads for like, what did I build that is probably still around, right? And these were accomplished, experienced engineers who had good, productive careers. So I think, yeah, I thought that was a neat, like the ceremony of destroying those servers, and represents a good. We've talked about that in the past too. Like you are not your code, and it's healthy to have a bit of detachment from that. And then yeah, so it all works out, and Maxine does get her reward. She becomes the first distinguished engineer in the company's history. Right. We talked a bit up the top, like we hope that came with some money, right? And we also hope that the people who are creating these $10 million businesses are getting at least a bonus, and hopefully they all have stock in the company or something like that. I don't know. What's your take on that, on kind of stock-based compensation, Nathan?
Yeah, I think from a high risk, high reward standpoint, it does it can align incentives properly, right? Is to get back to like Cal Newport's idea that our work is actually deeply creative, and
Uh-huh.
that's one of the things that we haven't seen with things like large language models, right? Even though large language models are doing really cool sort of you know work where you take a bunch of existing knowledge and sort of reallocate, arrangements of those things. From creative stuff is that, someone like Maxine or somebody who has vision of what's possible and then being able to run with it is deeply valuable, right? And if you're in alignment with the customer success and with the business, it's like dollars and cents valuable, right? You can actually see how it affects the bottom line. It makes a lot of sense from a capitalist standpoint is that we share risk and reward, and a lot of that's done through the value of the stocks of the company. And it's really cool as if the company's publicly traded, like Parts Unlimited is. There's actual liquidity to that, meaning that
Yeah.
once if you've been issued some stock options or you get maybe some big bonus tied to the performance of the company, that's another way of doing it. Is that you get to see the upside of this. And of course, the downside being is that if they're not making money, you don't get the bonus, or if they're not making money, your RSUs aren't worth very much, and you might sit on them for a bit. And so I'm a big fan. I think it's a very egalitarian way of giving upside pinned to the success of the company, and I think it's a very nice way to do compensation. Um, have you ever worked with a distinguished engineer before?
A distinguished engineer, not like worked with them. I have seen them present in big company meetings and things like that.
Yeah,
I think it's a super cool concept, right? I
me
think that's
too.
one thing the tech industry does really well is providing a separate career track for individual contributors.
Right.
There are lots of businesses where at some point, if you want to move up, you got to go into management. Um, and I think that's one of the healthy things we do is that managers are not necessarily like at one of the big tech places I worked at. Like, I just thought it was a really interesting dynamic that we had like our manager was like an L5 manager, but he managed an L6 engineer. And it was not clear who was in charge of who, right? Like, obviously, he had people management responsibilities, but like this engineer had a lot of sway. Um, and it's cool to see individual contributors with lots of sort of like influence in an organization. I think the tech industry actually has kind of nailed that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you? You worked with a distinguished engineer?
No, I've never have. I've met a couple of folks like who ended up being on that trajectory through conferences and stuff. I agree. I think it's a really cool path for folks who their strong suit doesn't transition into management, which,
Mm-hmm.
I think we haven't really talked about it much here, but it's really a career transition. Like if you go from being
Absolutely.
an individual contributor to managing people, it's a different skill set. You're not going to be writing code. It's one of those things where like I've seen this happen before, right? Where you get promoted into incompetence, right?
Yeah.
So I forgot. There's one of the laws. There's like some law that basically says like, given enough time,
The Peter
everyone's.
principle.
Oh, what is it?
The Peter principle.
Peter principle. That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll get promoted into incompetence, right? And so that's why
Mhm.
you look around, and you go, why is everybody incompetent? And you're like, they probably were amazing one step down or two steps down from where they are right now. Um, distinguished
It's a
engineer.
Michael Scott from The Office to a
Yes,
T, who was an
exactly.
excellent salesman who they
Right.
then promote to be the manager.
Right. Because he wanted everybody to be his best friend at the end of the day,
Yeah,
and that's not really
exactly.
a good management tactic. But the yeah, it's a really interesting um, career path, and I actually know a couple of folks who that's their goals, and it's cool to see somebody
Uh-huh.
who's motivated by, you know, adopting software architecture, adopting these things where they don't necessarily want to be executive leadership, they don't necessarily want to be a manager, there's this other path where they can basically be like a sage, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They understand the meta patterns. They can speak engineering. They still write code. They can really impact the way that proper engineering practices work in an organization, decoupled from the minutia of managing the business. And I think for certain personality types and for certain problem solvers, this is a dream job. You know?
Absolutely. And Maxine earned it.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Yeah, you get to the
Maxine,
end of the thing and you're like, Maxine's awesome. This was a cool.
yeah,
This
yeah.
is like warm and fuzzy. You're gonna be uh, so happy that this is how things turned out.
Yeah, it's funny to wrap this one up just because we spent a lot of time with this book. This is one of the only books we've done where I kind of listen. I did most of it via audio, and it was a very pleasant listen.
Yeah.
Um, good book. Well, let's get into kind of our closing questions. We like to recommendations and what we would do differently. We'll start with what we do differently. Any thoughts? You've talked about in the last weeks about having relentless optimism, maybe trying to start a rebellion if you were in a bigger org. Well, what are you thinking this week?
Yeah. So the Jeffrey Moore stuff really inspired me. I think now that I'm in a new role, thinking about the initiatives that I'm like starting to work on, and which horizon they're based off of, is really interesting and important. I also think I'm gonna. I don't know if we've put them in the backlog, but I think both Zone to Win and Crossing the Chasm would be great to have. Like,
I think we'll
yeah,
read those soon. If not, yeah,
yeah,
those will
and
find their way onto the
we're
podcast.
trying to oscillate between these sort of like meta type books and then deep dive. I think somebody actually in the comments recommended recently that we maybe look into the domain driven design,
Domain driven design, yeah,
which I think would be great because we haven't done a deeply technical book in a couple of iterations, and I
yeah,
think
yeah.
this would be this is like a. But I think we should pendulum swing back and forth like this, like how do we solve problems for the business because it's an important part of our
Uh-huh.
job, and then also like how do we become domain experts in some cool technology, and I think that's a good way for us to go. What about you? What are you going to do differently?
Yeah, I had mentioned in the last weeks again, kind of the idea of like finding a like-minded group. I wanted to focus on trying to just when I join a new team, get as many tickets done as I can. I don't know. There's something I've been thinking about because like what I would like to do is I'd like to be more invested in creating new ideas at work. Right. I also find it's a little hard, especially if you're in like a business domain that you're not maybe necessarily super passionate about, right? Like I like the development environment I'm currently in. My business domain is marketing software, which is not something that I am super passionate about. And so I don't find myself just kind of like naturally springing forth with ideas. Um, and so I'm not sure exactly what I should do to generate more ideas. I'm not sure if you can even force that. Like, but it is like I want to be more involved with like the actual business ideas, and making sure I understand. Like I was talking about where we said, are we Horizon 1? Are we Horizon 2? Are we Horizon 3? What kind of Horizon 3 ideas could I generate that would be really good for the business? So I get my distinguished engineer title in 15 years. And then, as far as recommendations, Nathan, who would you recommend this book to? You had mentioned in weeks past that you'd recommend it to folks who are trying to navigate a dysfunctional organization. Maybe feel like their company's processes are broken. Any changes to that?
No, I think that's primarily who I'd recommend this book to. Though, again, it's such a good read that I think maybe I'd broaden it a bit, which is that I think if you're if you want to have a way to be inspired to affect change in a larger organization, and you're new, or maybe you're having a hard time understanding how to like talk to engineering, I think this book could be really valuable. Somebody from the marketing department could read this book and I think understand how to engage with a Maxine out there. Do they see a Maxine that maybe isn't quite have as much gumption as they hoped? Is there a way that you can affect change without having to change the whole company? Because I do think that changing the whole company is an impossible task.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if you're looking for a framework to impact things and you're looking to do it in a technology driven way, I think this is a great book for those.
Yeah, I would also say so. In the past, I'd kind of mentioned like, well, it's great, gives you a peek at the industry. It's great for anyone who's interested in the idea of like a two pizza team. I'd also say this book is great, just like if you're someone who has been listening to this podcast and wants to be reading technical books, but maybe finds them a little dry, like this is a really great book to step into, right? We've read some books that are less dry. Like, for example, like I think Clean Coder is a really fun read, but at the end of the day, like it's not talking a ton about technical principles, right? Where you compare it with like, I think probably the two like densest books we've read are like, what is ChatGPT doing and why does it work? Which like that is dense. But Building Evolutionary Architectures, that one is also really theoretical and like heady. And I can see people kind of getting into those and being like, whoa, like this is more than I thought it would be. So like Phoenix Project is a great book that kind of splits the difference between the two, where like it's all about different technical concepts. It's very practical, but it's also structured like a narrative, so it's a little easier to digest. And so I think this is kind of like a great, if you're looking for something to split the difference, this is a great book. And we would recommend it. It was a fun read. I think we're excited to move on to new books, just because we've been with this one for a while now, 3 weeks, and that's but it's well worth it. Yeah, I mean, thank you everyone for tuning in. We've been really so pleased with how many people who are tuning in. We just hit 4,000 subscribers on YouTube. What are your thoughts on that, Nathan? It's a bigger number than I thought we might have.
Yeah, no, again, if you look back, I guess, almost 4 months ago that we started this,
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that we would have gotten this much traction. And I think we're just gonna keep focused on doing high quality discussions and keep working with getting these amazing authors on in the podcast. We've also got some other stuff in the works that I've been dragging my feet on a bit, but I'm like getting together some other types of guests that we should be able to have on the show, which I think will be a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It's if you're not familiar with like the know-how or like the nuts and bolts of how YouTube works, you need 1,000 subscribers and like 4,000 watch hours within 12 months to get monetized, right? And like for me, I thought if we reached monetization, that would be great, like within the first year, like having 1,000 subscribers. So to have 4,000 subscribers and well over 4,000 watch hours, I don't know what we're at. We're like 12,000. That's just on YouTube. Anyhow, big deal. And we have even more across all of our audio platforms. So thank you so much for tuning in. We're glad it's resonating with the audience, and really it's your support that keeps us doing this. And as always, you can always keep in contact with us at the Book Overflow Twitter account at Book Overflow Pod. Sorry, I hasn't been posting as much as it does. The way it usually tweets out quotes from the books, but because I listened to most of this via audio, I didn't have as many highlights as I usually do, and so there just wasn't as much stuff to tweet out. So it's been taking a bit of a hiatus, but we'll have more in the upcoming weeks. Follow me on Twitter at Carter Morgan. You can follow Nathan with his newsletter, Functionally Imperative, and also the interviews he conducts with Functionally Imperative at www.functionallyimperative.com. You can find Book Overflow at www.bookoverflow.io. I'll get that .com address one day. It's more expensive than I'd like it. And the book schedule is on bookoverflow.io. And you can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. And we hope you stick around because next week, we're going to be doing just one episode on this book because it's a shorter one, but we're excited about this one. It's Eunuchs, A History and a Memoir, written by our friend, Dr. Brian Kernahan. So we're very excited to read another book of his. I've already read about the first 30 pages or so, and it's great. Another pleasant read and also a bit of a narrative. So an interesting follow-up to the Unicorn Project. Well, I hope you stick around, folks. We're going to have a great episode for you next week, and we'll see you then. See you later.